Выступления наши будут на английском, но я по традиции начала это по-русски. И мы очень рады видеть у нас в гостях Нину Богдан, которая приехала из Аризоны. We have here also a guest from the City Hall, but she decided to have a presentation after Nina Bogdan.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you to everyone for coming. So today I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about the San Francisco Russian diaspora in the 20s. I'll briefly mention my book, but I'm not really going to talk about the book itself. Rather, I'm going to talk about things I couldn't include in the book. So you have to read the book, and then you'll enjoy it even more. This first slide, as you can see, I have a clipping from Ruskaya Жизнь, and it says Ruski Center, Russian Center. So it's not the Russian Center that we're sitting in today. It refers to a place in San Francisco, namely the intersection between Fillmore and O'Farrell, which was considered a Russian center in the 1920s and 1930s. So this is an advertisement for the Ruski Общественный клуб, which is the Russian social club. And it was on 1695 O'Farrell Street, which was right in the center of the Russian Center. And they had billiards and a restaurant, and you could play cards there, and you could have gatherings there. So these types of advertisements were in the newspaper, which the Russian Life began in 1922. And throughout the run of the newspaper, they were advertising all kinds of things. I'm going to be showing you what life was like in that time period. But first, this is my new book, Before We Disappear into Oblivion. It's available on Amazon, or you can buy it from the Queen's University Press site. So very briefly, the themes of the book are, firstly, the issue of immigration. I focus on the American West. Obviously, this is about San Francisco, but I also like to look at the entire West Coast. In the book, I talk about the kinds of how the immigration to the American West was a little bit different than to the East Coast of the United States. I talk about the permutations of race, ethnicity, and class. For example, in the 1920s, it was very common to say things like the Slavic race, or the Teutonic race, and in contemporary scholarship, that actually translates to ethnicity. So race and ethnicity were used in different ways, depending on the time period. But I talk about how these types of issues affected immigration, how they affected how people were either welcomed or not welcomed to the United States, and the issue of assimilation, which until fairly recently was considered a very positive concept, that you have to assimilate into the society that you immigrate to. But I kind of talk about the issue of how coercive it was for people who wanted to maintain their own cultural heritage and not necessarily to lose all of that in becoming American, and the struggles that they went through. And then one of the other themes is are the issues of trauma, which I discuss quite a bit, because the immigration process on its own, if it's voluntary, is fairly traumatic because people have to change their entire lives. But when it's forcible, when people are forced to leave a place, when they're forcibly displaced, when they are refugees, this causes long-term trauma for people. And in terms of the immigrants who came after 1917, particularly to San Francisco, most of the people who came had some kind of experience during the Civil War, when they were either fighting in the Civil War or experienced whatever other issues happen in war, the violence and basically all the things that happen in wartime. And that was kind of intertwined with nostalgia, which I discussed as well, and how people use nostalgia to better adapt to the environment that they were living now and sort of maintain sort of a mix of cultures. But in some cases, that nostalgia also held them back. And the immigrants themselves recognize that over time. So those are the themes of the book, if you ever decide to read it. But we're going to move on to talk a little bit about the 1920s. So just to give you an idea, these are photographs of the Fillmore district in the 1920s. So it's very different than what we know now. All of these buildings were torn down after World War II, so it looks nothing like it did then. And the other thing you might notice is there's very little greenery. There are no trees. So this, I think, was also a factor in why people began to think about going to places like in Sonoma County, because they missed the rural areas and natural environment. And so that tradition that we have of people buying dachas at Russian River actually started in the 1920s, which was new to me. I thought that was something that had begun after World War II, but people were actually doing this in the 1920s. They were buying plots of land and building little dachas, some of whom didn't have either running water or electricity, but at least they were out in the countryside. So I'm going to talk about all the different Russian clubs. We know, I think many people know, about the Russian club on 1198 Fulton Street. It's been, over time, it's been called the Russian Consulate and the Russian Embassy. That's incorrect. It was never a government institution of any kind, but it was a Russian club between 1927 and 1937, and they did some important work there. I talk about that in the book. They passed the White Russian Bill in the early 1930s. But before we had this big Russian club, which really is still there if you ever want to go see it, they had all kinds of different Russian community centers and Russian clubs beginning as early as 1920. So there was one club that was kind of interesting. It started as the Russian Artists Club. And it started in 1921 by a man named Grigory Golubyov. But interestingly, Golubyov was not from Russia. He was from New York. He was of Russian Jewish origin. And he moved to San Francisco, apparently because he decided this was a great place to make some money because of the Russian community. And so he opened it first on O'Farrell Street, and then it was at 1119 Market Street for a while. He kept getting in trouble with the city authorities because he was serving food he wasn't supposed to, and they kept trying to close him down. So then he would reopen as something else. So, but he advertised it as a bohemian cafe for people to come and have a good time. And so these are some of the advertisements from Ruskaya Zhizn for his club. So if you see here, these three people, that's him, Golubyov, Yermanov, and Dumbadze. So another interesting thing is that most Russians of this time period, I would probably say about between 60 and 70% change their names somehow. Whether they changed them completely, whether they shortened them, whether they translated them. For example, somebody whose name was Kuvshinov changed it to pitcher, or Ostrov to sharp, so which is very clever, or others to shorten their names. Bushmakin became Bush, Nishatov became Resh, so all of these interesting ways of changing names. Well, Germanov was actually an Armenian born in Turkey who changed his name to a Russian name, so he went in the other direction. I think it's kind of interesting. And then Dumbadze was obviously Georgian, but he came as a part of a Russian student group. So anyway, all of these people got together and started this Ruski Artisticheski Cooperative. And as you can see here, they served lunch and dinner, they had pirozhki, Кухня под наблюдением известного в Сибири Shanghai повара, so a famous chef from Siberia and Shanghai. And then this other one I just threw in here because it just shows the different kinds of events that were going on really on a weekly basis in San Francisco, and they were advertising in Ruskaya Zhizn for all of them. And they were also advertising in American newspapers because they apparently wanted to draw in Americans. So this one was particularly amusing because it says, "A night in Moscow," this is all the same club, "whiskers furnished." So apparently people would come and put on fake beards and mustaches to be boyars. And then, dancing and entertainment, a special Russian lunch and Turkish coffee. So again, very, very lively nightlife beginning early on. So with respect to, this sort of relates to another Russian club that was at, they opened it in the basement of the Holy Trinity Cathedral in 1920. And that club was a little bit more staid. It was for families. So the reason I bring this up is that of this couple, Igor Vodopayev, who changed his name to Vernon, and Vera Spring, married at Fort Ross in April of 1934. So this sort of introduces the theme of the fact that there were quite a few divorces. People tended to get divorced a lot and remarried a lot. And in the beginning, when I started doing my research, I would be shocked to find that someone who had been married was now married to somebody else, like in the 1930 census. And I assumed that the first spouse had died because I thought that people wouldn't have gotten divorced very often. But I was completely wrong because they got divorced all the time. So in this case, Igor had been married to Valentina Budberg, who was the daughter of Baron Budberg. And they both came to San Francisco and they split up. And Vera had been married to a man named Indus Alfred Gray, which was the son of a very interesting family. I don't know if I'll have time to talk about it, but his father was a Russian born Nicholas Gray, who arrived in the United States in the 1860s or so, and became an American citizen. I don't know what his real name was, but then he went back to Russia as an American diplomat, and he married a woman there, and Indus was his oldest son. So anyway, when Indus and Vera came to San Francisco, they joined this Russian club, and she met another man, another immigrant, and left her husband. And as you can see here, whoops, I knew I was going to do that. He was arrested at the request of his wife, and Vera said that she preferred to go to jail rather than lose her lover. But the point is that they split up too. And then she married Igor. So very complicated relationships that were going on. And this is the club where they met at 1520 Green Street. It was one of the earliest clubs that were started. And they were both warned that they were going to lose their membership because they were conducting themselves inappropriately. But I don't think that those kinds of things bother people very much, in that time period. So people met and socialized in these clubs, and it was kind of just a very different environment than they were used to, but they took to it very, very easily in terms of how they, lived their lives. And by the way, Igor and Vera also divorced. So, end of that story. So speaking of Valentina, I want to mention her because she was actually one of the few people who was able to maintain a business throughout the entire Depression. Many people opened businesses, including restaurants and cafes, but clearly it was very hard to maintain those businesses in a period when, after 1929 in particular. But she first opened her Russian tea room on Russian Hill, which I thought was very interesting, on 1001 Valera Street. And she was very good at promoting her business because she was next to the Hillcrest Club, which was a place where ladies lunched, the higher sort of elites of San Francisco. And as you can see in this particular ad, they said they were going to produce the Firebird, Ptitsa, and the play has been written about the legend from Russia, and the inspiration for the scenes came from the drawings in the Russian tea room. Now, Valentina mentioned in an interview that she had decorated her second restaurant at 326 Sutter herself with painting, so maybe she did it in the Russian tea room too. But so she really knew how to market her brand, so to speak, and she became more successful and later moved the restaurant downtown to 326 Sutter, and it catered not just to Russians but to Americans. So she closed it finally in 1941, and that was only because her son, who joined the army, went to LA and she went with him. But otherwise, she was quite successful in her business dealings. And so this is just in terms of historical continuity. We're sitting at Russian Center in that building on 2450, 2460 Center Street. And here is an ad from 1924, 100 years ago plus. And it's for a performance at Turnverein Wolf, which is Turnverein Hall. And Turnverein Hall was the Russian Center before it became the Russian Center, because it was a German center from after it was built in 1911. So here, sitting here today, you're all part of that history. So other entertainment for people were traveling groups that would stop in San Francisco and perform, and this was a very popular show. The problem for Russians when they were trying to stage things was that they were not successful in doing plays because the plays were in Russian. They couldn't attract an American audience. So they stuck a lot to dancing and singing, which, obviously anybody could attend. And it was clear from here because they say drama, pantomime, music, comedy, ballet, interpreted by Russian genius. But pantomime was something that they used because it was something that was cross-cultural, and they could appeal to people who weren't necessarily fluent in Russian. But these were very popular shows. A version of it ran in New York as well. So there were plenty of options for entertainment. Right. Excuse me. So this was very interesting. Bula Slava Rossiya was a film that was made in Imperial Russia prior to World War I. And this man named George Tarasov brought it with him from Harbin, and it was shown in San Francisco. There were several showings, at least 3. So it made a big stir in San Francisco. Everybody wanted to go see it, and as you can see, the quote here, speaks to both nostalgia and, the pain of loss. I don't know if this film still exists. It would be interesting to find it if somebody has it. Tarasov, I don't know what happened to him after he left San Francisco. I think he went to New York. But when people left San Francisco, I kind of didn't follow their path because it's like, you left, okay, that's it. I can't spend time on it anymore. But what was interesting, he was in a car accident in the Bay Area in June of 1926, and he was seriously injured. And that brings up the point of the automobile. The automobile was fairly new. It was a new modern convenience. And I was really amazed at how many people were seriously hurt or killed in car accidents in this time period. You would think that because the vehicles didn't go very fast, that it would be unusual to have somebody injured, but it was constant in the paper of people being injured or even killed in car accidents. So that is not a new phenomenon either, unfortunately. So Americans were also interested in, particularly Hollywood was kind of interested in Russian history in, the Americanized version. So there was a couple of silent films that ran, Siberia and the Volga Boatman. I haven't seen either one of them. I collect films, but I haven't found these. So both of them were promoted as love stories, although the Volga Boatman story was ridiculous because it was some aristocratic woman who fell in love with a woodlot. So, there's ridiculous kind of story. But these are silent films, and many, there were Russians who in this period, who did pretty well in Hollywood with silent films. But once the talkies started, it became a problem because if they had heavy Russian accents, they couldn't get jobs anymore. And the other person that is highlighted here is Emma Mirovich, who was a very popular performer in San Francisco in this time period. Here she is going to perform in Pikovaya Dama. So as you can see, they had a very rich cultural and social life in this time period. They had a lot of choices in entertainment and in doing different things, whether it was performing themselves or going to shows. So it wasn't all gloom and doom, because my book is a little bit depressing in some cases because I talk about the kind of problems that people encountered in immigration. So this is a more uplifting kind of presentation. I know this is a bad picture, but I wanted to show it because this is another performer, Tamara Lau, who came early on, and she was very good at sort of promoting her brand as well. I talk about her a little bit in the book, but you can see how she was advertised, armed Rus dancer in SF ready for trouble. 2 daggers dangle from waist of tiny girl. So these are kind of these effusive sort of descriptions of performances. But she did quite well. She opened her own dance studio, and then she later moved to Los Angeles. There was a lot of traffic between Los Angeles and San Francisco in this time period. People would move back and forth a lot. People had family living in Los Angeles and visiting and vice versa. So it was kind of a, I didn't focus on LA at all in the book, but that's maybe a future project. And then this is Nadezhda. Her actual name was Sidomatnikov. She changed it to Yermolova. I'm not really sure why. I know there's a tradition that if you're a performer, you should not use your real name in like sort of elite circles, but I don't really know. And Tikhomirov was her husband, but they also got divorced. So she was also very successful. She initially worked so she arrived in Seattle, which was fairly common. For some reason, the fare to Seattle was cheaper than to San Francisco, so a lot of people arrived in Seattle. And there was also a Russian community in Seattle, but I didn't really look into them. She initially worked in a factory, which was very common. Most people either worked in factories or other, menial jobs. And then she was able to open her own ballet and dance studio, and then she also moved to Los Angeles. This person, I just found her. I mean, she's not anywhere in the book, but I found it interesting that she was called the Mad Hatter because she was a milliner, and that was very common as well for women in particular. To take those kind of jobs. But she was very successful. She originally, she went to LA first and designed hats for the Hollywood studios, and then she moved to San Francisco, so she did it, in the other direction. And when she passed away, her friend described her as a Mad Hatter in her obituary and noted that she would ride on the back of a motorcycle when she went to Hollywood to party from San Francisco. So she was, a wild and crazy gal. But this term, Mad Hatter, I don't know if anybody's familiar, like from Alice in Wonderland, we know the Mad Hatter. That term was actually started because people who were in this business tended to go insane because of the chemicals used in making hats. Again, something to keep in mind that during this time period, there was no OSHA, there's no nobody looking out for whether or not you're using dangerous chemicals. And it was the same, for example, a lot of men were upholsterers because that was a very lucrative business at that time. And it was the same issue because they used this kind of glue and chemicals, and it eventually affects your mental health. Although I think in her case, she was fine. They just called her the Mad Hatter because she was, I guess, kind of a crazy gal. So this is an interesting picture. It's the Invalid Ball in San Francisco, and as we know, the Society of Veterans would hold the Invalid Ball to raise money for veterans who are disabled in Europe and in China. What's interesting here is that it was combined with this welcome to Baklanova. This is from this here. You see, welcome to Bogdan. And she was also an actress who came to Hollywood and became, fairly successful. I'm not really sure why they were honoring her at this particular event, but this is her. She married another Russian-American film actor, and they lived for a while in Hollywood. I forgot what I was going to say. So also on the verso, they mentioned that Arseny Khyanov, who was a physician in San Francisco, is the pianist, so I think he's back here. I just find this interesting that they made this point to honor this woman. Oh, and also I had to mention that I did find one of her films, and it's called Freaks, and it's really weird. It's about a circus, and she plays this very negative character who takes advantage of like a little person, but they actually used, this is 1933, they used actual people who were in the circus, so it's very strange. I don't know that I would recommend it, but she's a pretty good actress. Give her credit. So sports were big with Russians in the 1920s. Of course, Ivan Podubny was visiting. These are just ads from Ruskaya Zhizn and telling people to come to the Dreamland rink for the fights. But also, everybody I think is familiar with the Mercury Club that lasted into the later period or contemporary period. So in November of 1925, the first organizational meeting of the Russian Athletic Club happened. And at the time, that they called it the Russian Athletic Club, and the Russian soccer team was the Mercury soccer team, and they would be playing other ethnic groups. They were also involved in boxing events. They later played in tennis tournaments with the Serbs. So this was a very developed kind of athletic activities. And then this was kind of new to me, that in January of 1926, they did an annual run across the city from the Ferry Building to the Cliff House. So Beta Breakers is nothing new. This was already going on in the 1920s with the Russians participating. Then we had advertising that was aimed at the Russians. I think the editors all translated the American ads, themselves. This was a furniture store, coffee, and then of course the ubiquitous cigarettes, Camels, Slovo Kurishika Znataka, talking about how great Camels are. So yes, people took up smoking quite a bit in this time period, including women, and that shows up later in terms of health. As people got older, clearly the smoking was problematic. But, this was the 1920s, so people had options for banking. The Bank of Italy, which later was the Bank of America, had a special Russian department, and they hired Russian immigrants to work in these departments. This little booklet is in the museum. in the Events and Arts file, and it just outlines the services that the banks provide, and they serve the entire Russian community. Shanovsky was actually a person who came, I think in 1909. He was not an emigre per se, but he was somehow attached to the Russian imperial government, and then he had some semi-official position, and then he got a job as the head of the Russian Department of the Bank. So he was kind of a figure that was involved with all the Russian communities. He was involved with the immigrant community, he was involved with the Molokhan community, and he was very helpful to people, obviously, because it was because of him that probably he would recommend people to get jobs there, and so there were several people from the community working in the bank. Business opportunities were constantly being advertised. Chicken and egg, chicken farming was big in the Petaluma-Katati area from this time period. It was actually started by Russian Jewish immigrants who came earlier, but a lot of Russian immigrants tried to take up farming, not only in Petaluma, but in Half Moon Bay and Santa Cruz. Most people did not succeed. Farming is very difficult. If, your chickens get sick, you lose everything. If the price of feed goes up, and remember, most of these people were starting with really nothing and just hoping it would work out. But in this ad, we have a man named Vladimir Zumov selling his 5 acres of poultry farm. And then this was another idea to start a Russian farm colony on the peninsula and trying to, persuade people to join. I don't think that ever got off the ground either. But these were all advertised in Ruskaya Zhizn.
Время.
All right. So again, back to vacations at Russian River. This is an ad showing 2 girls fishing in 1927. This is interesting because this is a Russian newspaper for Russian people, but they spelled Russian River, Russian River, instead of just saying Ruskaya. I don't know why they did that. It was kind of interesting. But so they're saying, thousands of visitors want to visit the Russian River to get away from the city. But I thought this was interesting too. Dushного города, летом, and we all know in San Francisco, summers are cold. So I don't know where they got the dushna погода, but maybe it was an extraordinarily hot summer that year. So this is very interesting because, unfortunately, I found these photographs after I published the book. They're from Jordanville Museum. And this is the dacha of Gleb Ilyin and his wife. So Gleb Ilyin was a very famous artist. He was actually fairly well off, unlike most of the rest of the community. And you can see here, it seems like he had a nice house. But the Mir Zakomirskis, I only know of one couple in San Francisco. Most of them, I think, were on the East Coast, so I don't know a lot about them. But apparently they were very friendly, and so these are photos of them at his dacha in 1933. And Gleb was one of the people, or he had dreamed of starting or building a Russian village in the Russian River area, and he proposed this in the 1930s to the community, but of course that never got off the ground either. It was the middle of the Depression, nobody had any money. I don't think he had any financial problems, but there was no way, I think, that was going to happen, but he really wanted to have a separate kind of like Russian colony with Russian Ruskaya Izby and everything, and just to have a Russian atmosphere. But, one of those ideas that just never got off the ground. So, violence and crime, there was a lot. In this particular case, I'm highlighting here, I was very interested in this young man, Viktor Shimonayev, because I knew that something happened to him when I was looking at his parents' naturalization petitions. The practice was to list all your children, and they had 3 sons, but they only listed 2 in 1928. So I couldn't figure out what had happened to him because I couldn't find a death record. I could usually find a death record, and I couldn't find it. But then, again, after I published the book, I found articles in the newspaper that described this story that Victor, who was studying at UC Berkeley, he was a student, he was studying mining engineering, which was very common, and another Russian student, Theodore Shostin, and an American friend, they took over the mining claim of this prospector who got into a dispute with them, and he killed them all. He just basically murdered them. He was on a bluff, on top of a bluff, which looked down on an area near the cabin where they lived, and he just shot them all. They were unarmed. And he was prosecuted and sent to jail and everything, but, obviously this was a horrible crime. I think he had, obviously, mental health issues, but, the details are really unknown because all of the men were killed. And, there was really... The wife of Harry Clark, who was not there at the time, claimed that Paul had made advances to her, so there was all kinds of issues. It was horrible, obviously. Can you imagine if you're arriving to a new country and, your son gets killed like that? But the other issue here is that Theodore, who was not an immigrant either, because he arrived around 1914, very young. He came with his father, then he left, and then he returned, and he apparently also enrolled at Berkeley. But the year before, he and Victor had been driving taxis to make money, and Theodore got beaten unconscious because there was a taxi driver war. So here's this poor guy. First he gets almost beaten to death, and then he gets shot. So obviously it was not an environment that was necessarily calm and pleasant. I mean, these were kind of rough neighborhoods at the time, and a lot of violence going on. And the other issue, of course, is, as I noted, they were at university, but they all worked. And so back then, university was obviously not as expensive as it is now, but most people couldn't afford it. And if Americans went to university, they were generally at least of upper middle class or elite status, and most of them were wealthy enough that they didn't have to work. Their parents were able to pay for it. But for Russian students, those who managed to enroll and to learn English and to enroll, most of them had to have jobs. And so this is why Victor first worked as a taxi driver, and then he tried to do this mining thing. And that was very common. Most students didn't have, their parents either couldn't afford it or they were here alone. So they had to work their way through college if they did manage to enroll in university, which was, there were several, of the students that came, the minority actually enrolled because of the language issue and money, but there were people who did enroll and went on to pretty stellar careers, whether it was in science or engineering or professorships, but they were the minority. So this is another case of violence now on the part of a Russian emigre. I do mention him in the book briefly. He arrived with his parents in 1923. He was a child, and it's interesting because this is him with his mother somewhere in San Francisco. I don't know the address. And then, of course, this is him as he began his life of crime. He started pretty early. He was arrested for stealing bicycles, and then he began to, I think, rob banks. He was imprisoned in Wyoming. He escaped from prison, and then he was killed in Omaha after a robbery and a gunfight. And that was also fairly common. He was not the only person that I came across who got into a conflict with police and just got killed. And so, they didn't take any prisoners back then. So the interesting thing about this family is that, again, he arrived with his parents, who got divorced, and she remarried another emigre, Dmitry Polsukin, And then then she passed away in 1960, and he remarried an emigre from the second wave. And the reason this is interesting is that these photographs, not this one, this is like a prison photo. These photographs and many others were left to the second wife, who really had no connection to them except for that she'd been married to the husband. And she had an American friend who found me and said, "Are you interested in these photographs? Because otherwise, I don't know what to do with them." And so I actually directed her to contact the museum. I don't know if she ever did. But she sent me scans of most of the photographs. But what I thought was great was that she went through all the trouble of doing that, because this is how records get lost. People pass away, and if there's no one who cares, they just get thrown out. But in this case, luckily, they didn't. So they were very patriotic, the group of this time period. This is a translation of the Declaration of Independence in this for 3rd July 1925. And then there's Abraham Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address. So they periodically would publish these very patriotic articles and encourage people to vote and to participate in civic life. So this is the Gray family. Again, they were kind of an interesting anomaly, because I mentioned before that Nicholas Gray arrived early on. He went back to Russia and married Catherine Hunter, who was she was the daughter of an American man and a Russian woman, and she was born in Petropavlovsk. So they married, and he then became a vice consul, an American vice consul in Vladivostok, because he had become a citizen a while back. And they had 12 children. But then he passed away in 1912, and the family was destitute. They had no money. So even though technically Catherine was a U.S. citizen because her father was American, and the children were all U.S. citizens, they couldn't come to the United States because they had no money. So they stayed there until either they raised money or they got somebody to help them. And then they all came to San Francisco between 1917 and 1924, the 10 surviving children. 2 of them died. And then, of course, I mentioned that the eldest son had been married to Vera, who later married Egert Vernon. I don't know anything more about this family, but I find them very interesting because they're kind of this anomaly of, a Russian-American family in a different context. So these are photographs that I found on Ancestry.com. This one is in the book, and the photos were Red Shuttleworth, who is the grandson of Sergei Novalenko and Dina, allowed me to use this photograph in the book. And he described it as his words, that these were his father's gangster friends. This is actually his wife, and then I don't know who these two people are, but he described them as his father's gangster friend, or his grandfather's gangster friend. And these other pictures are just from his website. This is Sergei and his daughter, and then the family in Russia who did not come with Sergei, and Sergei in the military. A lot of Russian men joined the military, particularly to fight in World War II. This actually was one of the, when I started doing the research, I found many people on Ancestry.com who are descended from this Russian first wave, but who live all over the country and don't necessarily know their history, and they post these photographs. They're very interesting, and they're looking for information about their family. So I got in touch with him, and he allowed me to use that photograph. And he is actually an award-winning poet of the American West, Red Shuttleworth. So I just, as an example, I put one of his poems here. He sent me a book of his poetry. He's a wonderful man. But as you can see, he's continuing sort of the creative life of his family here in the United States. He's won all kinds of awards in poetry. And another family that I found on Ancestry, a descendant, was the Afanasyevs, who were Peter Afanasyev. Pyotr Yefimovich was a photographer. So a lot of the photographs that are in the museum, like of the events that took place, were taken by him. Christy Gerhardt, who is a descendant, allowed me to use a photograph of Olga's wedding at Holy Virgin Cathedral. That's in the book. And these are just photographs of the family, Claudia and Olga, and then Olga with the long hair. I thought that was a really cool photo. But again, people who are descended from these families, very interested in their family histories. And I just threw this in here because I just completely ran across this photograph without even looking for it when I was doing some research. This is the Borzov family who moved to Berkeley in the 1920s. And in this article, they were actually interviewing Nikolai Borzov about China. It doesn't really have anything to do with Russia because they live in China. But as you know, Nikolai Borzov was very instrumental in just all kinds of educational activities and cultural activities in San Francisco. So this is him, this is his wife, his mother, and Boris is one of his children. He had seven children, and they all lived here in the Bay Area. And these are some of the photographs also that I found online. None of these families, as far as I can recall, are actually connected to San Francisco, but it just struck me that these people who are descended from Russians have really held on to these photographs and are looking for information. You can see that they're probably different classes. Like these are more middle class, maybe merchant class. This is more peasant family. But all of these people have posted about their families online. If they weren't connected to San Francisco, I didn't really pursue, but just like for future reference, I thought it was really interesting that there's all these people around the United States who have some kind of Russian roots, and I'm trying to find more about them. And so to end, just to say how important cultural heritage preservation is, it had already become a discussion in the Russian community in the 1930s. They were concerned that they were losing a lot of the materials that people had brought, documents that were being thrown away, photographs, jewelry and other items that were being sold. So they established libraries and almost immediately at several locations, including the Society of Russian Veterans and the cathedral and the club. They rejected at the time an offer from the San Francisco city government for space at the Presidio or Goldgate Park because they were so afraid of losing control of their materials. They were kind of paranoid about it a little bit. And so the first physical storage space was again at Holy Trinity Cathedral, which was kind of central to the community. And then they purchased this building that we're sitting in today. And then there was the opening of the Museum of Russian Culture in 1948, which has allowed this community to, maintain their heritage. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. And I think I will end on that. Thank you.
Nina,
Yeah.
Can you please introduce Melanie?
Yes. This is Melanie from the City Planning Department, and she was instrumental in getting the Russian Historical Context Statement completed, and she will talk about that and other things.
Thank you, Dr. Bogdan. And thank you to the Museum of Russian Culture and to all of you for welcoming us here tonight. As Margarita and as Nina said, I'm Melanie Bishop and I work with the San Francisco Planning Department. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about the Russian American Historic Context Statement, or what we're calling the Russian American Community History Project today. Great. Okay, so myself and my team, we work on a broader city-sponsored effort called SF Survey. And this is a multi-year project that is, the goal is to identify and document places of historical, architectural, and cultural importance in San Francisco and advocate for the preservation of those places. So that could be sites, it could be buildings, it could also be more intangible things like visual and performing arts, festivals, things like that. So that's what I work on with our team, and the Russian American Community History Project is part of this broader effort. So we know that a lot of folks in our community are already doing this work, and they're the experts on this. And we've been working with a number of different communities on community history projects that are specific to their history in San Francisco. So in addition to the Russian American Historic Context Statement, we've also been working with folks on an American Indian Historic Context Statement, a Chinese American Historic Context Statement, and then of course Pan-Latino. And then a couple years ago we adopted our African American Historic Context Statement. So a lot of different efforts in progress right now to kind of acknowledge the important role these communities played in San Francisco's history. And we hired Dr. Bogdan to write this historic context statement. So it's basically a narrative history of Russian Americans in San Francisco. And as I said, it's focused on places. And we worked with Dr. Bogdan, who identified a number of themes that you can see on this slide here that we kind of already touched on in the previous presentation. But these are things like settlement and immigration patterns, the history of Northern California as Russian America, cultural and social movements, Russian American businesses, and important Russian American community leaders. And if you scan this QR code, the draft is available on our website, but we also have some paper copies that you're welcome to take a look at or take with you when you leave today. Okay, so as part of this effort and through Dr. Bogdan's research, we worked to identify a number of sites across San Francisco related to Russian American history and mapped them here. So it's a bit difficult to see. We have a bigger version that's available out in the hallway. And you might be familiar, there are already a few city landmarks related to Russian American history, including the Ventura Hill Neighborhood House, the William Westerfield House, and then Old Holy Virgin Russian Orthodox Cathedral. But you can really see kind of the pattern of settlement here in San Francisco.
Well, surely Holy Trinity.
Yes.
An historic building.
Yes. I don't believe it's currently a landmark, but it's something that we can propose for a landmark. It's acknowledged as historic.
I proposed it a million years ago. I know the woman who did it as a landmark, but also as a historic building.
Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to keep my presentation pretty brief, but I thought maybe we could go through a rapid round of photos that we found through the research, and if folks know what the photo is, maybe just yell out the answer. Okay, so I'll start with an easy one. Hopefully everybody knows the answer to this one. Does anyone want to say it just for the sake of...
Well, it's Russian.
Okay, great, thank you. Is anyone familiar with this photograph?
Russian Renaissance?
Yes. I think Dr. Bogdan, you included this in the context statement. It's such a cool photograph of the interior of the restaurant. Is anyone familiar with these folks? Or with this location? I need to consult my notes here actually to remind myself. This was a place called Dee Dee's Russian Room. And this photo is from 1941, so might be a bit older.
I know. It's a construction of...
Oh,
Yes, I'm sure a lot of folks, families are maybe around when this was being constructed out in the Richmond. What about this one?
Holy Trinity on 1750 Powell Street. That sounds
Yep.
like Powell Street.
Yep, so this is the location on Powell Street, and this is actually the cover image on the context statement that Nina chose as well. I guess I didn't realize, but this one has kind of the answer on the slide for you.
Well, that's
Yes, Kazan Church
Wow.
on California Street. Yeah, so I think this had an addition added on top of it, right? Yeah. Anyone familiar with these?
I think that's the 1949 parade or some event. It's some kind of parade or some kind of a.
Yeah. So, according to the library, this is a float that was part of the celebration parade for the opening of the Golden Gate Bridge.
Oh.
That's 1937.
Yeah, and I guess that's maybe why the bridge is on the float here.
Russian Bridge.
Yes.
It's Russian now.
Yeah.
Designed by a
Does anyone know who this is? Yes, I think I heard it out in the crowd. So this is a photo of Victor Arnatov, and let me get the date here for you. This is from February 1929. And then we also found this really great photo of him painting the murals at Coit Tower. Yeah, he kind of blends in right here. But yeah, I thought that was a really nice photo.
What was his name?
Victor Arnatov? Yeah. Excuse my pronunciation also.
Oh, everybody knows.
Yeah, this is a pretty iconic photo, right?
1925.
Yes. And this is the Diamond Jubilee, is that right? Of California, okay. Yes, so yeah, I think this is also in the context statement.
Elena on the top. Elena on the top.
Oh,
And we
right.
have the dress of that lady in the next room.
Oh, is it on one of the mannequins?
Yes,
Oh, wow. Okay.
she kept it and gave to us.
That's great. I didn't realize that. Okay, and I think these are also photos from that like same parade, I believe. So here's a float, and then Russian contributions to California.
Sigmund Stern Grove, 1936 or 37.
Yes, so someone said this is Stern Grove Festival in 1936 or 1937. I think I also pulled these from the context statement. So this is a flyer for that fair. And this is kind of one of the booths and some attendees at the fair as well.
Oh, well, fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a couple of folks said the Ventura Hill Neighborhood House. So this is one of the current landmarks, and I think this photo's from the 1920s of some folks there. Okay, so that concludes my presentation. So I just wanted to close. This has definitely been a huge effort with multiple people involved, including Dr. Bogdan. But I also wanted to thank the Russian Center and Museum of Russian Culture, as well as Russian American Community Services, Slavic Voice, and then we've worked with some broader city partners on this as well as some individuals that I recognize in the room who contributed their own family stories. So thank you to you all as well for contributing to this important effort. And I just wanted to close by letting folks know that we are scheduled to bring this before the Historic Preservation Commission, which is a body that kind of supports the preservation of culture in San Francisco. We're scheduled to present with them this Wednesday on this historic context statement, and they will elect to adopt it and recognize it formally as like a city-sponsored community effort. So We have some materials outside on a bench that you can take, including a community guide that goes over what's included in the historic context statement. It also includes the map of sites. And then we also have something called our community stories, which is a way for folks to contribute their story to this effort. We have that available in paper copy, or you can scan a QR code if there's something that you'd like to be included in this effort, a story about your family, a story about a specific place that you know. So definitely check out the materials that we have outside, and I'll be around to kind of hear any thoughts or questions you might have, but thank you all very much.
Sorry, let me say a few words. So I think for me it is an amazing day today, because we are here working in the dust. We are collecting materials, and we don't know, maybe somebody will find these documents, maybe not. And today, this day, when we see that the all collections we keep or somebody else, it is really going to reality. Thank you, Nina, and thank you, Melanie. Sorry.
I wanted to present this book to Margarita, your official museum.
I was just wondering if the house on Lion Street is considered a landmark.
Veterans.
It's not a landmark, but it's included in the statement as a possible building of interest. Yes.
Thank you.